Jessica, you can start now.
So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of the Asia Pacific Evaluation Association, I am genuinely delighted to be your moderator today. My name is Jessica Oddy. I'm the Director of Learning and Evaluation at Global Fund for Children, joining you from Mauritius. And we have a really rich session ahead of us, one that I think will challenge how we think about evaluation, knowledge, and whose ways of knowing we centre in our work. Before we begin, though, I want to share a couple of housekeeping notes. And Randy, if you could just go on to the next slide, please. So during the session today, please make sure that you keep your mic and video off to lessen the load of the internet bandwidth and preserve the event quality. For questions and concerns, please leave them in the chat bar. And you don't need to worry about recording during the webinar. The webinar recording will be shared and uploaded onto the APEA website. And also just to say, please do use the chat. We want this to feel like a living conversation, not a broadcast. So introduce yourself, share what brings you to the sessions today. And also throughout the presentation, feel free to share your thoughts and perspectives. Now, I'm delighted to hand over to Anna Erika Laressa, who is the chair of Eval Youth Global, for our opening remarks. So Anna Erika, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and good evening from the Philippines, and good morning and afternoon to everyone joining us from across the region and beyond. And on behalf of APEA, the Global Fund for Children, the Center for Evaluation of University of Sri Jayawardenepura, the Eval Youth Global Network, and the Asia chapter, the APC Hub, and our own community ownership group at the APEA, and our community of practice, community owned SMERL, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this APEA webinar series. And today's webinar, we are going to continue to push the boundaries on how we can make evaluations more engaging, more inclusive, and most especially more meaningful. So today we are going to be having creative methods in community evaluation, which could not be much more timely with everything that we are dealing all around the world. And today we have one learning goal, and it's essentially to move from being extractive researchers to being relational evaluators who puts reciprocity, equal partnership, benefit sharing with the communities that we serve at the heart of evaluations. So for this objective, we are very, very fortunate to have Jessica Oddy, who's the director for Learning and Evaluation at Global Fund for Children, with us, serving as our moderator. And of course, to our well-published and highly accomplished speaker today. I'll leave the introduction to Jessica. But we are certainly very excited to hear more about her work, how we can be both rigorous and imaginative in our evaluation work to be much more participatory, much more involved and informed, and ultimately much, much more human. So I hope everyone will enjoy today's webinar. And Jessica, I'll bring back the floor to you to begin the highlight of this event.
Okay, thank you, Anna Erika. And it's now my real honour to introduce our speaker, Dr. Helen Kara. Dr. Helen Kara is an independent researcher and scholar whose work has consistently pushed the boundaries of what research can look like, who it can serve, and who gets to do it. Her contributions to creative, ethical, and decolonial approaches to research methods have shaped practitioners across disciplines and across the world, including myself and our team at Global Fund for Children, where we're really committed to looking at trust-based and community-led approaches to learning. So Dr. Helen Kara has been an independent researcher since 1999, and As I mentioned, she specialises in creative methods, radical research ethics and creative academic writing. Dr. Helen teaches doctoral students and staff worldwide and has written a wide range of books which we'll put in the chat as well, including Creative Research Methods, The Practical Guide and Research Ethics in the Real World, Euro-Western and Indigenous Perspectives. Really excitingly, Helen has founded the International Creative Research Methods Conference, the Journal of Creative Research Methods and the Independent Research Ethics Committee. And I think what I find particularly powerful about Helen's work is that it doesn't just ask how we research, it asks why, for whom, and at what cost. And those are exactly the questions this community needs to keep asking. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Helen Kara.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. I'm going to try hard to live up to that introduction, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen so you can see my slides. Yeah, that's the one. Because I think that will be more useful than if you can't see them. It always makes the chat disappear when I do that, which is kind of annoying because, as Anna Erica said, using the chat is a really great idea if you have any questions or thoughts to contribute or resources to contribute. Because yes, I've done a lot of work on creative methods, but I do not know everything. I will never know everything. There is too much to know. And there may well be people here who know useful things that I don't know. So if you're one of them, please, contribute. That would be welcome. So yeah, independent researcher, etc. There's a PDF of these slides to be circulated, so you'll have my contact details. One thing I can't deal with in webinars is private messages in the chat. But if you want to get in touch with me, you absolutely can. I'm not difficult to find online. So there we go. That's enough about me. There's much more interesting stuff to talk about. Evaluation is an applied form of research. So research is a sort of umbrella term. Evaluation is one type of research that exists within that. And I think it's useful to consider where research may have begun on this planet. We'll never know for sure, but my own theory is that it began where a little marine creature stuck a fin or a flipper out onto land in a sort of, what's this about then kind of way, to find out about something it didn't understand, something it didn't know. And I think when the aliens land, they will conclude this is a research planet because every culture, every community does research. It's intimately linked with storytelling and it's highly relational, although you wouldn't necessarily think it from looking at some of the recent history of Euro-Western research methods. And this history is very recent. I think this is just useful to consider. I'm not going to go through all the details, but the first systematic clinical trial that we know about took place in 1747. It may indeed have been the first, and that's less than 300 years ago. The questionnaire was invented in 1838. That's less than 200 years ago. The interview was devised by journalists, but then researchers saw journalists getting useful information out of people by just asking them questions, which in the early 20th century was a quite radical idea for researchers. And focus groups were invented within living memory, not mine, not quite, but my father's. He was alive in the early 1940s, and focus groups were first used in World War II to assess the impact of propaganda. So the thing is that these methods were creative not very long ago, certainly not long in terms of actual human or planetary history. And yet some researchers reify these. They call them traditional methods, but they haven't really been around long enough to be called traditional, in my view. So what I think we can take from this is that new methods can be devised and indeed are being devised. You may yourselves, any one of you may have already devised a new method of gathering data or analyzing data or whatever part of the research process, or you may yet do so. It's not like we've found all of the methods we are going to need for the rest of human history. We haven't. And since the 1960s, there's been a real massive increase, and it's still happening, in terms of research creativity, which I personally think is a terrific idea. And this has taken an awful lot of people. I am currently temporarily something of a figurehead for this, but it wasn't me who did it. I just had the idea of collecting a lot of other people's work into a book. Essentially, that's what my book on creative research methods is. So there are a whole bunch of us, and I know from just having a quick look at some of the participants, some of you, I know your work, some of you, I know you personally. Some of you, of course, I've never met or anything, but it's a really growing movement and community. And the work I've done in founding the conference and the journal, particularly, and also the ethics committee, which works very creatively, they're all linked, is to give a more stable foundation, really, to the community that I care about so much. And it's a worldwide community, and you're all part of it. So that's lovely. So up to the 1960s, if you read reports of Euro-Western research, the researcher is always he, and not just a he, but a white, middle-class, able-bodied he. But from the 1960s, that really did start to change. So we started to see more activist research, like disability research, feminist research. Queer research came a bit later. It's usually dated back to a particular conference in the States. Strengths-based methods, which I think will be close to many of your hearts, where research isn't conducted with a solely deficit lens, where evaluation can take into account the strengths of a community or a group, as well as what that community or group may need to expand or improve. And all of these led to the mantra, nothing about us without us, which is routinely used now by many, many groups and communities around the world. I could talk about all this in much more detail, but I know we're a bit short of time. So I'm going to talk about the actual practices more. Transformative research frameworks are frameworks like community-based evaluation, participatory evaluation. And the key point about these is they take us from the sort of very passive ethical approach of let's not do any damage to a much more active, proactive ethical approach of let's actually make the world a better place as best we can, even if only in a tiny way through a small evaluation in a specific place. It's still a more positive action because we're looking at promoting positive social values. And this is the only place where I'm going to quote myself. So I mentioned participatory, community-based, action research-based, trauma-informed. If you haven't come across trauma-informed research, it's worth looking at. It's one of the newer options. But if there's any evidence or sign of potential trauma among your participants, and trauma is hugely prevalent, then it's really worth looking at. Co-creation, of course, I'm sure you're all aware of. Easier said than done, but it is possible, and many people try hard and do well with co-creation. So all of these are much more relational than your kind of standard extractive parachute in, ask a bunch of questions, parachute out the end in terms of participant involvement, not, of course, in terms of the evaluation. But these frameworks are about really working with people. They demand more of us as evaluators. They demand more time. They demand more thought. They demand more care. It's really important, this, because these frameworks are not perfect. They can address power imbalances, but they can't, we can't fix racism with one evaluation. We can't fix the patriarchy with one evaluation, etc. But we can help and work to reduce those kinds of power imbalances. It's more resource intensive. It can often take more time, which means more money, or if there's no budget, more time, which means more stress. There's more cost. None of this is to say we shouldn't use transformative frameworks, but we need to go into using them with our eyes open. New ethical difficulties can arise. A lot of researchers think it's a really great idea to do participatory evaluation, but how participatory is it if the researcher is the only person who is being paid for their time and effort? Of course, the evaluator is going to put more time and effort, so I'm not saying everyone should get paid the same, but participants should receive some direct benefit, I believe, for their participation. It might not be money if there's no budget, but there are other options like a time swap, where if a participant gives you an hour to help with your evaluation, you could give them an hour to help with whatever they need that's within your abilities. So a lot of thought and care is required, but I don't want to put you off. I just want you to be realistic about how it can be when you're using these frameworks in evaluation. It's a lot easier to do extractive research, which is why it's still so popular. I don't think that's a good excuse, though. I'm sure you don't either. So that was the Euro-Western paradigm, but that is one of the two major paradigms on this planet. And the Indigenous research paradigm predates Euro-Western research. It's because Indigenous peoples around the world use oral histories, they can trace their research back 45 to 48,000 years. And that's the case in various different places on the globe. One of the difficulties here is that Euro-Western and Indigenous are words that we use to describe peoples with actually a huge amount of diversity within them. So Indigenous peoples are not homogenous, they are not one thing any more than Euro-Western peoples are. But there are a lot of commonalities. The oral tradition that I've mentioned is one. Working with and for and from community is another. And in the Indigenous framework, as far as I can gather from my reading, there's no separation, as we have in the Euro-Western framework, of conventional methods and creative methods. So I think that makes more sense, really. I can sometimes feel like Euro-Western research is sort of clawing its way back to what Indigenous researchers have always known. It's all the fault of the so-called Enlightenment, which did absolutely the opposite, but that's a whole other discussion. What I've learned, I'm a student of Indigenous research. I'm not an expert. I've learned from reading, and I've been lucky to learn from a small number of Indigenous researchers online and in person at conferences and seminars and in discussions and so on. But I'm not an expert, but what I have learned is there's a lot of literature. In fact, this photo is very out of date now. I should do another one. Indigenous research tends to be very holistic. It's very relational, very creative, and highly ethical, which is great. And I've been encouraging Euro-Western researchers to learn about this and to look at their own practices in the light of what they've learned about Indigenous research and ethics. Talking of which, again, this varies between Indigenous peoples, but broadly speaking, as far as I can tell, there's a lot of commonality around some particular principles. Relational accountability is one. Relationships in Euro-Western research are generally thought of as between people, but many Indigenous communities have a much broader understanding of relationship as being not just interpersonal, although that's part of it, but relationships with the environment, relationships with animals, relationships with the cosmos, relationships with dreams and ideas and communities and all sorts of things, very broad. And Indigenous researchers regard themselves as accountable to all of these relational webs. There's a sense, again, this is directly opposed to the Euro-Western idea of intellectual property. Knowledge is a communal good in Indigenous communities. You might generate an idea in the privacy of your own head, but once you speak it, it belongs to everyone. Reciprocity. So as I've mentioned, research participants gaining some direct benefit, not taking part out of the goodness of their hearts for some imagined future population. And benefit sharing. So sharing findings of evaluations, sharing learning, sharing other benefits that may transpire, like further funding, etc. All that kind of thing is really important for most Indigenous researchers, if not all. So some creative evaluation methods, and this has come from my work on creative research methods more broadly, which I realized I could conceptualize the field into these 5 categories. They're not exclusive. People can do work that is arts-based and digital, or embodied and multimodal, or sometimes using all 5 frameworks or approaches in one project. I'm going to run through these in a little bit more detail. Arts-based, people often think of the visual arts, I guess because we're such a visual species. But in fact, arts-based evaluation can include the written arts, music, performance, dance, etc. And of course, you can see with video or photography, that's where the boundaries immediately start to break down because that's arts-based and uses technology. Each of these pillars offers us opportunities and challenges. We've talked about the transformative research frameworks. Arts-based methods can be really useful if you're doing evaluation where it's a bit emotional, a bit personal, a bit sensitive, or where there are language barriers, and these may arise for a number of reasons. They can be because you're working across cultures and you perhaps don't have a fluent spoken language in common with participants, or it could be because you're evaluating services for people with cognitive impairments, like stroke survivors, brain injury survivors, people with dementia, and so on. And of course, with children and young people, arts activities are often very popular and a really good way to generate information. Not all straightforward, though. We need to be understanding of our own skills. Going one step outside your comfort zone is a good place. Going half a mile outside is not, because you'll have a nervous breakdown, and we don't want that. So we need to stick within the arenas that we're good at. We might think, oh, would be a great idea to disseminate this evaluation in the form of a comic. But if you've never made a comic, if you've never read a comic, then that's the half a mile outside. It's too far, unless you can find someone to collaborate with, which is always an option. Also, participants, this doesn't generally, I've never known this to apply to children and young people, but some adults are nervous of some arts activities or feel like they're maybe not going to be good at it, or perhaps a school teacher told them they weren't any good at art, or whatever it is. Or it can be for other reasons, such as dyslexia, disability, colorblindness. If you're using visual techniques, that can be a barrier. So we need to be aware that there may be these problems that arise, and have other options available. In fact, I'm seeing coming through more and more now in the methods literature that researchers are offering a little menu of methods, a few choices to participants as different routes in, and they can choose the one where they feel the most comfortable. Analysing arts-based material can be great fun to gather, and it is possible to get carried away. I have done this in my early days as a researcher and ended up with a whole lot of photos and posters and collages and poems, and I had to figure out how to analyse it all. Then it was hard. Now it's much easier because we have the Handbook of Creative Data Analysis. I was looking for a copy to hold up to you, but I can't find it. Doesn't matter. But we have resources to help us. But even so, a general mantra for research is collect less, analyse more. That's often a helpful way to think. And some research audiences still think that arts-based research or arts-based evaluation isn't the real thing. It's kind of fluffy, girly rubbish. Those people are dinosaurs, and they will die out, but they're still around. And if they're going to be in your audiences, then you need to take that into account and perhaps work in different ways. Lovely point in the chat from Lynn. We'll come back to that when we get to the questionsy bit, but thank you, Lynn. I think that's really relevant. So some methods of data gathering include enhanced interviewing, where you can ask a participant, or you can both draw something, make something, perhaps do it together, perhaps do it separately and then discuss each other's, or bring artifacts to discuss. Technology, I mentioned photos and video. That kind of technology is more readily available now. When I started in 1999, we used to give participants disposable cameras and then get actual prints of the photos, 2 sets, one for the participants, one for us. Come a long way. Writing, of course, poetic inquiry is a big subset of arts-based research. Diaries, journals, just writing can be useful. The visual arts I've mentioned. Maps are very powerful instruments for describing relationships, locations, interactions. You probably think of a particular type of map, like a Google map maybe, or some other form of geographic map. But there are lots of ways to map things. There are lots of different kinds of maps. It's quite fascinating if you choose to look into it. So the second, or rather the third, because we've done the transformative, the third kind of framework is embodied evaluation, where evaluators and other researchers are beginning to take into account our own embodied sensations, sometimes asking participants to report on their own embodied sensations, their emotions, their physical sensations, whatever feelings they may have, and so on. And this can be really useful if we're evaluating something that's very much around a phenomenological approach or lived experience, or something that is very embodied in itself. So if you're evaluating a sports team, or building people working on a building site, or these kind of personal embodied experiences like illness or stress, pregnancy and childbirth, another very embodied experience, perhaps breastfeeding, these kinds of things. And sensory research, it's becoming more popular now to, for example, collect soundscapes and use those as data, using the sense of hearing, smell, taste, all of these different senses, and balance. All of those kinds of things can be relevant or not, depending what you're evaluating. If you're evaluating a women's gymnastics team, then balance would be very important and relevant. But as with all, there are challenges. The early embodied researchers, some of them got a bit overexcited and a bit too navel-gazy, and Yeah, relief maps are great. Thank you, Jessica. That's a good point. So if you overdo the embodied element of your evaluation, it can be unhelpful, and you're unlikely to use only embodied data, but embodied data can be a very helpful element in some evaluations. If we're asking participants to take account, or even for ourselves, if we're not used to taking into account our internal feelings and sensations, that can be a bit destabilizing. So we need to be aware of that and ready to support someone or to manage that for ourselves. And it can be difficult to figure out how important, how relevant, how to prioritize the embodied data over other data. Also past and present, because some phenomena we can't evaluate in the present. If you want to evaluate maternity services, childbirth, you can't do that you can't do evaluation with a participant who is giving birth, because that participant is way too busy to answer your question. So we have to ask later. You might want to evaluate crisis response to road traffic accidents and talk to people who've been in road traffic accidents. Again, we can't do that in real time. We can't ask someone to get in a car and crash it for us, because clearly that would be hugely unethical and dangerous. So we have to ask, how did it feel to you? And if you've been through any of these kind of intense physical experiences or surgery, it can be really difficult to remember how it felt. And also, we all have our own feelings in our bodies today. And if we went round and asked everybody in this session, everybody would have different things to report. Somebody might be a bit upset or a bit angry or feeling cheerful. Somebody might be in pain or itchy or too cold or too hot. There's just so much going on. So it's not easy, but it can be very useful. And the literature is expanding massively on embodied research and embodied evaluation at the moment. So some ways of doing this, the people who are really keen on embodied research say quite reasonably that none of us can do research without our bodies. That's fair, but it's also fair to say that we can choose whether or not to pay attention to that information. The key to this data gathering is, as I've said, being aware of and including these bodily sensations. Figuring out what to include and what to exclude that can be difficult with any kind of research, but particularly with this one. It's multimodal. It's always multimodal, because we used to call that mixed methods. I'll go into that in a minute. But it always is, because it's never only embodied data, or very rarely, maybe the odd autoethnography, but it's pretty rare. Using technology can be called digital, but not all technology is digital. Potato printing is a form of technology and it's not digital. So is the wheel or sails. So again, this offers a lot of opportunities. The internet, when I was starting as a researcher, if I wanted to use a questionnaire, I had to design it on paper, print out a cover letter, sign that, fold them up, put them in an envelope, write an envelope to myself, stick a stamp on, fold that up, put that in, seal that envelope, put a stamp on that, write the address of the recipient, make a pile of those, take them to the post office. Took ages. Now I can just bang something together on SurveyMonkey and stick it out on social media. Not always a benefit, though. Just think about how many requests we get. Every time you buy a coffee, they get a thing saying, please go online and give us feedback about the coffee. And sometimes you just want a coffee. That said, using technology can make life easier for participants, particularly if it's a technology with which they're familiar. So, for example, if you were doing online research with a particular group, you would look to see where they gather online, what forums, or what. Obviously, you have to get permission from the coordinators, but it can make life much easier. There's, again, talking about the internet, there's so much big data, so much open data that you can use. And using secondary data first is something we should all be doing ethically, even if it will only answer part of our research question, because then we don't need to ask participants for so much, and research fatigue is a real thing. But also challenges. If you're using electrical tech, it can go wrong. There's the so-called digital divide, which is an unhelpful expression because it indicates a binary, and this is not a binary situation. If you have a family of 6 and they have one smartphone between them, you've got mum, dad, 4 kids, they all want access to that. How much access? They're on the we've got access side of the so-called digital divide, but then again, most of them aren't most of the time. So it's very complicated. And if you've got all the tech and the skills in the world, if you're in a desert region or a coastal or mountainous or forest or one of the other regions where there's no possibility of any connection, it doesn't matter how clever you are or how rich you are or how much kit you've got. If you don't have the skills, and also new ethical difficulties. New technology always brings new ethical difficulties. Just look at AI. I'm not going to start talking about AI because we'll be here till hours. But lots of ethical difficulties. But there's lots you can do: online surveys, online focus groups, also getting people to use non-digital technologies in groups. I mentioned potato printing, or that kind of thing. Secondary data, big data. And social media offers lots of opportunity for gathering data. There's ethical issues around that, but again, we'll be here all day if I start on that. So let's look at multimodal evaluation. Most, if not all, evaluation is some sort of multimodal, because evaluation is very good at the kind of numbers for the outline and then qualitative work to color it in, as it were. We used to talk about mixed methods. I did my first degree in psychology, social psychology, in the early 1980s, in the height of what we called the paradigm wars, but for quantitative and qualitative paradigms. My degree was pure quant, my first degree, and in the third year I asked if I could do a qualitative dissertation, and the gasps of horror could be heard all around the university campus. It was just not an option. I'd learned about qualitative research by going down interesting rabbit holes in the library, which I often preferred doing to following what I was supposed to do with my reading lists. That's a whole other story. So to begin with, some innovative people thought, well, what are those other people doing? Maybe it's interesting. Let's take a look. And began to, as evaluators for a long time have, often gathered both quantitative and qualitative data, analysed them separately, and then looked at how those findings might integrate to tell a useful story. But now we realise that we can set research into context in different ways. You might use documents and statistics, different things. We can analyse data in different ways. We can present, and so on. So it's particularly useful where you've got an evaluation question that one method is just not going to cut it. And that's often the case with evaluation. I did evaluation research for 25 years, probably should have said that at the start. There are some difficulties, though. As always, more methods means more resources. You can have conflict if you're doing interdisciplinary work, which evaluation, again, very often is. The ideal of integrating findings is not always easy, but then you can figure out different, what it tells you then, which can also be useful. And it's particularly important to plan carefully. It's always important with research, but with multimodal work, it can be so tempting at the difficult analysis stage to think, I'll get a few more interviews and it'll all make sense, and it really won't. So I was asked to talk for 20 minutes and I've just about managed that, which is quite rare for me. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hope that we can have a bit of a discussion and some questions, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much, Helen. There's so much to sit with there. And maybe I'll start by opening this up to the group. If anyone would like to share some questions or reflections from what Dr. Helen shared, you can put them in the chat. I think you may have the option to come on off mute and use audio, but I'll just wait a couple of minutes before
Lynn
I
said
also have...
in the chat, I wanted to just go back to this because I promised that I would. Lynn said they come across issues around use of play versus experimentation or curiosity because of the association of play with childishness in some English language communities. I think that's a really interesting point. I advocate for play in research. There is a prevailing view that children learn through play, but you know what? Adults do too. We do. And there are other things too. In some English language, like comics are seen as for kids in English language, in many English language communities. But you go to France and you get comics in very prominent positions in the bookshops because it's seen as a really useful, adult, important art form. So I just wanted to come back to that because I thought that was a really important and useful point. I think it was when I was talking about the difficulty with some audiences of presenting arts-based research if people really are not willing to understand how important these methods are. Have I ever done? Oh no, hang on. I'm just looking. Thank you. You're welcome. You're all very welcome. The chat is Zoom chat is harder to manage than it used to be. Anne is saying, have I ever done Indigenous style research with low literacy communities? I wouldn't ever call it Indigenous style research, but I've used creative methods with communities where literacy in the UK, literacy levels are surprisingly low. Something like 1 in 7 adults in the UK is not functionally literate. So I never assume, unless I'm working in a university or something, if I'm doing community-based work, I never assume literacy because it's not sensible to do that. So I've used lots of creative methods. I've used sometimes using a bit of writing or drawing. So like timeline research, I've used big timelines on walls and said to people, right, here's 0 to 5. Your child, from when your child was 0 to 5, and the children might not, some of the children aren't even 5 yet. But above the line, I'll put the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at regular intervals with 0 and 5 at each end. Above the line, write or draw the good bits where they would happen. Below the line, write or draw the difficult bits. And everyone seems able to pretty much engage with that, which is good. And if people can't, I say, let's have a talk about it, and I'll help you do it. There's many, many of these really straightforward methods that are really accessible. And some people see that as dumbing down research, and I don't see it as that. I see it as making research accessible and helping as many people as possible feel safe and comfortable within the research space. That's certainly something we could talk about for a long, long time. Femi's got a hand up, and there's a couple of other questions in the chat. Femi, do you want to give us your question, and then we'll take the next ones from the chat?
Yeah, please. Thank you. I have to say that was an excellent presentation. You kind of articulated a whole bunch of things I've been bashing around my head for years. And it's kind of, you've got that aha moment. That's what I wanted to say. So thank you for that. But one of the things which I've been trying to get around, I've got a background in community evaluation, participatory action research, is endings. One of the things about it, I remember working on one project years ago where the group of people who I'd worked with for a while, I suddenly realized I'd have to they needed to be disbanded, but I couldn't articulate why or even how, under what auspices. But one of the things about it was with your own research, particularly in community evaluation and the kind of parallel of community of participatory action research, what do you think makes a good ending?
That's a really interesting question. It brings me back to a point about the difference between Euro-Western and Indigenous research. One difference is that in the Euro-Western paradigm, we're moving away from this now, but novice researchers are still routinely taught to create rapport with participants, to put them at ease. I'm in favor of putting people at ease, but I'm not so much in favor of using my, albeit fairly limited, friendship skills instrumentally to get data out of people. And I realized that's what we were doing when I read about Indigenous research, relationality, how it's community-based, how many Indigenous researchers will not even consider conducting a research project unless it will, at a minimum, maintain and ideally strengthen existing relationships. I cringe now when I think about some of the people I worked with, sometimes for long times, and then just sort of stopped really talking to. That was normal in the 2000s. It's probably still normal now, but I wish it wasn't. I'm trying to find you a reference for this, and I can't. But I've discovered there's quite a lot of literature on leaving the field. So that might be a good place to start. In terms of I think the best endings are when endings don't happen, really. When we stay connected, when we stay in touch, but we can't always do that, and we're not always asked to do that. So I don't have a recipe for you, Femi. I don't have a little checklist you can work through to make your ending work well. And it's going to be different in every context and with every group of people. I suspect it's going to involve some discussion, some pain. Sometimes a celebration can be helpful, a celebration of what's been achieved and an acknowledgement, some kind of ritual that you devise to acknowledge, to include everyone. Food and drink is never a bad idea. Acknowledge what's been done and celebrate what's been done and acknowledge the need to move forward and move on to other things. That might be useful, but again, it depends on the context. So I hope that's some help. I'm aware we've got quite a lot happening in the chat. Analysing creative methods. I've just realised I have the paperback to hand. Here you go. It's just come out in paperback, the Handbook of Creative Data Analysis. It's also available digitally, of course. I'm one of the 3 editors. This book took me years to achieve. I couldn't have written it. I can write books, obviously, but there are some books that I know I can't write. I couldn't have even edited it well enough on my own. I knew that too. And finding the right people to help me actually happened in a webinar like this, set up by one of my publishers in 2021. And the hardback was published about 18 months ago, and now the paperback's out. And this will help you a whole lot, MP, in terms of analysing creative methods. I recommend it to you, and I'm just so delighted to have that resource to point people to. Right, what else have we got happening in the chat? That's a good question about, hang on, I don't want to miss anything, and I'm finding it really difficult to manipulate.
Would it be helpful for me to read the questions out for you, Helen?
Yes, please, if you would, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we've got the answer to the analyze creative methods. Please, people, take a look at the book. Got a question from Hamed. Is it not also already starting with what we consider as knowledge in research? Do you have experience how to include other knowledge, research and evaluation, which is maybe from a Western perspective, often not, which is maybe from a Western perspective, often not seen?
Yeah, I think we just have to do it, really. I mean, there are Indigenous researchers pointing the way on this who are including knowledge from dreams, for example, which a lot of Euro-Western researchers, unless they're studying dreams, would probably regard as irrelevant. And yet a lot of people have quite important relationships with their dreaming life and between their dreaming life and their waking life, and learn from their dreams. And this is not unknown in Western thought. Freud was very keen on this. Sigmund Freud, psychoanalyst from the turn of the century before this one. And he wrote books about that. But it's sort of, as far as I can tell, it's kind of fallen out of favor outside of actual psychotherapy practice. So this whole creative methods thing is a bit of a movement, really. And I know APEA is working hard on this generally. And I think we just have to say this knowledge is important. This knowledge counts. You know, for a long time, women's knowledge didn't count, wasn't important. We haven't finished that battle, but we've got a long way. Women can now found journals. It was only about probably 50 odd years ago that women couldn't even publish in academic journals because academic journal editors were all men who told women researchers that nobody, brackets, no men, would be interested in what they were writing about. So they weren't going to publish it. But women didn't give up, and we need to not give up. We need to just keep doing this. And the more we have these kind of sessions, and the more we talk about these things, and the more we get them into the academic literature, the more acceptable they will become. I better stop now because there's lots more questions. Go on.
Yeah, we've got loads. Okay, so we've got a great question here around. So sometimes it's around working in institutions that sometimes may not allow you to pay your participants if you're doing, for example, participatory action research. So do you have any tips there? And then the second question there, any advice on how to quote or interpret art pictures and analyze them with neutrality, if that's possible, to minimize bias?
Back to this one for the second part, but for the first part, I mean, a lot of this is about bias. People hiring institutions or commissioners of research will say, if we pay participants, that will incentivize them, it will bias them to take part. But those institutions pay researchers to do research, and frankly, being paid to do research biased me towards a research career in the first place. So I don't see why it's okay for researchers to perhaps maybe stay in jobs they're not enjoying because they're getting the money out of it. You know, we all need to earn a living. We all need to make a living. And I really don't get why research participants have to be so different from researchers in this respect. I'm sure there are researchers in the world who do research for nothing, do things out of the goodness of their heart. I mean, I do quite a lot of unpaid work. This session is one example of that, and I'm very happy to be doing it. But I do need to earn a living, and I can't do, you know, I get asked to do unpaid work that I often turn down because I have to limit the amount of unpaid work I do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to pay my bills and put food on my table. And that applies to participants too. We're all people who need these things. We're not different. And it frustrates me that institutions still have this separation. There's often a separation. I did a lot of work in the early 2000s for an innovation in the UK, then called Sure Start, which was for families with children under 5, probably why I used that example earlier. And we used to have, these were participatory projects. We'd sit around the table and we would all talk about the parents this. We weren't the parents in the community, but there were some of those parents were part of these groups. And after a bit, I started saying, let's just look at who is a parent. And some of the people who weren't classifying themselves as parents were actually parents. So it's just something that's been a real theme for me. My whole working life as a researcher has been, let's not have these different categories and then treat people differently. Don't get me on lived experience with this, because that's another thing. People get paid less. I'm autistic. I sometimes get asked to take part in research because of my lived experience. What other kind of experience is there? And I get paid less for that than I do when I get asked to take part as an expert. So that's kind of weird and annoying. And I was once on a bid where I was being put in as an expert, and there were people with lived experience. And the first bit of feedback I said was, can we equalize these fees? Which meant me earning a bit less, them earning a bit more. But they didn't go for it. But I tried. What else have we got?
So, and I think this kind of links actually to this last point around power dynamics. And we've got a question here from Ritu. If you could share, or if you have an example of how researchers or evaluation professionals have addressed the power that they can hold over communities.
Oh, that's a huge, huge question. I mean, I think some researchers revel in the power they hold. I think that's a real thing. Euro-Western researchers anyway. I think one of the key first things is to identify where the power sits as best we can. It's not always visible. It's not always possible. And having conversations about it can be really useful too. And also recognizing our own power. Often I think human beings on this planet, in the state it's in at the moment, don't feel very powerful. And in global terms, perhaps we're not. But we do have power. We have power when we're analyzing data. We have power when we're working with participants. We have power when we're writing things or scripting videos, making videos to disseminate our work. Whatever we're doing, we have power in that action. And we need to think first about how we use our own power and whether we do that ethically or not, and then start thinking about other people and where the power lies and what we can do about that. If anything needs doing, it doesn't always. Sometimes you've got a community with a good distribution of power within it who are willing to work with you and have these discussions, and it's all comparatively straightforward. Other times it's really difficult. You might be working for a very powerful institution who wants a lot of say about how your evaluation is done, and you don't think it's right. And then the community you're working with has different ideas, and then you're trying to reconcile all these competing powers. But communities, if nothing else, communities have the power to say no, or to say not unless it's done our way. I don't know if you've come across the work of the San people. I'm just going to find you a very quick video, which we're not going to play, but I'm going to put the link in the chat. The San Code of Ethics, which was published in 2015. The San people live in southern Africa. Oh, hang on, let me pause that. And they are nomadic, largely nomadic. They travel a lot. They work across the countries we call South Africa and Botswana. And they now have their own code of research ethics, and researchers who want to work with them have to abide by this code. And more communities are creating their own codes of ethics. I've been working with some not Indigenous communities, although I'd be happy to do that if I was ever asked, or at least to give it a go, have some conversations about why me, and then maybe give it a go. But with communities here in the UK, different charitable organisations, and so on. So yeah, all that really. It's a big, these are huge questions. They're good though. Just go ahead.
Yeah. And just maybe relating to what you said, we've got a great question here from Adil. And it says, is it a challenge for non-Indigenous researchers to conduct Indigenous evaluations? Should they even try? How do they unload, unlearn, and adapt to those knowledge frameworks?
Yeah,
Should
they even try? Well, several big questions. The should they even try is a really big question. I I think I'm just looking for there's an Australian system called Malpara, which I've come across before, which is about doing evaluation with, not to, not on, but with. And I think if a non-Indigenous evaluator is going to work within an Indigenous group or community, it needs to be on that sort of basis, that it's with, not. I'm just trying to find a reference that I can pop into the chat. I think it's called Malpara. I'm looking in my own indexes because I can't remember what I've written in my book, so I have to look it up. And if it's not in the indexes, then we're lost because I do usually get Malparara. That's what I'm getting wrong. Malparara. There we go. I'm going to put a link in the chat. This is just the first thing I've come across on Google Scholar, but it will give you an idea. SALT approach sounds good, Ritu. You might want to elaborate a bit more on that or pop a resource in the chat. So I'm certainly not saying that it should never be the case that a non-Indigenous evaluator works with an Indigenous community or group. But I think it only needs to happen when the Indigenous community or group really wants it to happen, not just because someone else, some organization with power and money says so. Two-eyed seeing, that's absolutely right. That's a really, really great one. And I've written a bit about that too. And yes, that we should work with, and this should be a principle in evaluation anyway, that we should work with communities as much as possible rather than doing evaluation to them. But even more so where there's such an obvious power imbalance as between non-Indigenous evaluators and Indigenous communities. Yeah, that would be my thoughts on that. My brief thoughts. All of these questions, I could probably talk about each one for an hour.
So I think we've probably got time, or hopefully we've got time for maybe one or two more. And I have a question here around recommendations, like how to disseminate back to the communities or the people that you've been working with.
On the basis of whatever their needs are, what's going to be accessible for them, that's what to consider. And that will be different for every type of community. You may have to disseminate in a range of different ways to reach different people. If you did research in a primary school with young children, you might need to have an easy read version with pictures for the children, and a more adult version perhaps for the staff, and perhaps something in between the two for the families. There might be all sorts of different ways. But the first thing is to figure out what the community needs. Are there any accessibility needs? Does everyone in this community speak a language in common? If they don't, you probably can't use much writing. If they do, then you can. Or speaking, would they respond better to a video or to something written? Do they need pictures? There was one woman I was talking to in South Africa who'd done research with rural farmers, and I forget the research topic, but she disseminated with a map showing her findings, just a visual map. And they loved it. They absolutely loved it. It worked really well. So it just depends on who the community is and what they need. That's what you need to figure out first.
Fantastic. And I think we've got one final question in the chat, and it's from Kajal. And it says, can you please share your thoughts on the acceptable language which is used in research? I'm noticing empathy and care becoming more fashionable, though what we're essentially talking about is love, which would be considered as flowery language. Please discuss.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. The use of language changes over time. I've stopped using stakeholder. Stakeholder was a very common word, still is with the European Commission. And it's a colonialist word. The original stakeholders were the American settlers who literally staked out their claim to land that they were stealing from Indigenous peoples. There's a good journal article about this, which I'll stick in the chat. There we go. Where is it? I'll find it in a minute. So we need to be aware of and consider our language and be willing to change our language at all times. Love is an interesting one because people regard it as a bit personal. Like in Euro-Western research, you rarely hear people talk about spiritual things, whereas in Indigenous research, you often do. So there can be those kinds of differences. It's a moving target. And essentially, I think if there's language you want to use it. If you want to talk about love, let's talk about love. Let's use the word love. If you're experiencing love in your research encounters, or your participants are and they're telling you about it, I think we should use that word. I think we should try not to use jargon unless we're only talking to another audience of evaluators or another audience. You know, if you're a medical evaluator and you're talking to doctors, you can use all the medical jargon you like, but generally let's not use the jargon. Generally, let's use plain language. I mean, academics used to think that an indication of cleverness was to use very long words in very, very long sentences. And now people are understanding that it's actually much cleverer to explain complex concepts in everyday language so that more people can understand them. And yes, absolutely, Wendy, using the language of the community, absolutely that. So yeah, language is something very important and well worth thinking about. So thank you for that question. Thank you for all of your questions. They've all been good ones.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And I think just I'm mindful of time, so I think we've answered nearly. I think we've answered nearly all of the questions. And I just want to say a big thank you to Helen and for everyone who has contributed to the conversation. And I now want to hand over to Maduka, co-leader of Eval Youth Asia, for our summary and closing remarks.
Jessica, before that, we need to take the group picture. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So before our closing part, there's going to be a group photo for those of you who would like to be in it. Please keep your cameras on. If you don't want to be in the group photo, by all means, keep your camera off.
Ahmed, over to
Okay.
you.
Yeah, please open your camera all. Yeah, we have 4 yeah. Okay. Slide 1. Slide 2. Slide 3. And slide 4. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Jessica, over to you.
Yes, so I think I'm going to actually hand over to Madika, who's going to close for our summary and closing remarks. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica, and hello, everyone. So I hope you had a great time today, and we have come to the end of another engaging webinar, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. And today our speaker, Dr. Helen Kara, began with a fascinating overview of the evolution of research methods, how they started and how they have developed into the approaches we use today. And then she introduced a range of creative evaluation methods beyond traditional practices, including art-based, embodied, and multimodal approaches, and as well as the use of technology in evaluation. And importantly, she also highlighted that while these methods open up exciting opportunities, they come with their own challenges. For example, art-based methods can be particularly valuable when working with sensitive or emotional topics and in cross-cultural contexts where language can be a barrier. But at the same time, their effectiveness depends on the skills and engagement of both evaluators and participants. So personally, I found this session truly eye-opening, and it encourages us to think beyond conventional approaches and to bring more creativity into our daily evaluation work. And so on behalf of the team, I would like to sincerely thank Dr. Helen Kara for sharing these valuable insights and for her time and effort today. Thank you very much, Dr. Helen Kara. And a big thank to you as well, Dr. Jessica Adi, and for your excellent moderation. And last but not the least, dear participants, thank you very much for your active engagement. And we hope you will take these ideas forward into your own work. And thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Over to you, Jessica.
Okay, final words from me. So again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, APEA for this wonderful session today, and most importantly, for all of you who showed up and shared resources, shared your questions and your suggestions in the chat. And I just want to wish everyone safe onwards travels, and please do sign up. I think Ritu has posted a link in the chat to the community. Follow APEA on LinkedIn, on social media, because there are regularly talks, conversations and sessions. And yeah, we look forward to continuing to be in community with you all. So thanks everyone. And thank you so much, Dr. Helen, for your such thoughtful and interesting conversation today.